Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody. I'm Alex Stone. I'm here in Zurich. Welcome to Women in Football's latest webinar. Really happy to have many of you joining us this afternoon. So far, the feedback we've been given has been really positive. We're really glad you're enjoying the series. So I'd like to do a big thank you to everybody so far, and also particularly to Belinda and Anna for joining us today, and really excited to hear the conversation this afternoon. To those of you who don't know our guests today, I'll introduce Anna first. Anna has been women's sports editor at The Telegraph since March 2019. She'd previously written about sport at The Observer and The Guardian, and had always been a very big helper to me, especially when I was a very green PR back in the day. Her work has taken her around the world, covering Olympic Games in Athens, Beijing and London, as well as World Cups and World Championships. And she's interviewed some of the biggest names in sport and continues to profile some of those to this day. Some of you may have seen a fantastic piece with Marta last week. In 2007, Anna co-founded the Women in Football Network with Shelley Alexander. She's the mum to two of her own mini-WIFs, and she works tirelessly still to create a more welcoming environment for future generations of women wanting to work in football. She was awarded an MBA for services to journalism and women's sport in the 2016 Queen's Birthday Honours List. And I'd like to say a big welcome this afternoon to Anna.
Thanks, Anna.
And to my left, as I look at my screen, we have Belinda. Belinda's been a curator at the National Football Museum since 2012, when she insisted in the move of the museum's collection from Preston to the museum's new home in the Urbis building in Manchester. After managing an Arts Council-funded project to document a newly acquired collection of material relating to the history of women's football, Belinda began to specialise in women's football and played a key part in the museum's decision to aim for 50% representation of women in football across its collections and exhibitions. Belinda's now working alongside the women's football community to continue to implement this strategy. I had a little sneak preview earlier, which I think she's going to tell you about this afternoon. So I'd like to also welcome Belinda. Wish you a great next hour, and you might see me pop up back at the end. So Anna, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. That's a really nice introduction. And hello, Belinda. It's such a pleasure to be able to speak to you this afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me to take part.
Oh, not at all. Just for a bit of context, Belinda and I first met over the phone, actually. So this is like the closest we've ever got to each other on a Zoom, ironically, in the lockdown. When I was writing a piece a few years ago about the exciting developments happening at the National Football Museum around women's football. And it was brilliant to be able to speak to Belinda then. And I'm really looking forward to all the updates we're going to hear today. Before we get started, there's a few sort of parameters for anybody joining in. Please feel free to introduce yourself on the chat. You can just select all attendees on the little drop down menu on the bottom right, say who you are, what you do, or where you're from. Obviously, please keep your chat positive, respectful and polite, which I think goes without saying, but just in case there's any hecklers on here. Obviously, this brilliant Women in Football series has come out of the lockdown and the pandemic, and that's the reason why they're hosting these webinars. Professional football in England was suspended on Friday the 13th of March, and we've seen the repercussions of that, particularly in women's football, where, of course, the WSL was cancelled this week, which provoking strong opinions all round, but I think that we can all agree that it's a great loss, and potentially we won't have had any domestic women's football for 6 months by the time we see the WSL return. So all the more important to be able to get a bit of women's football this afternoon. We've got a real treat for you, as well as hearing about Belinda's career and how she started working in museums, and why she ended up working in football. She's going to very kindly show us some of the exhibits that are at the National Football Museum, and we'll get a bit of a preview of those, and a personal private guided tour, which I think is really exciting and I'm looking forward to. Before we get to that, Belinda, you know, this lockdown business is tough, and I know you're a mum of 2 kids. How is it going for you?
It's not too bad overall. Luckily, I've got a fantastic employer. NFM has been brilliant with supporting people working from home who have kids as well, so that's been great. So yeah, overall, I just consider myself to be in quite a positive position. Still working, safe, you know, and able to try and continue doing some of the things we were doing before, just in a slightly different way. So not too bad.
And I mean, it's really tough having 2 kids at home, isn't it, when you're trying to work? Are there, you know, do you tell your kids, you've got 2 boys, haven't you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2
do
boys.
you tell them about the work that you're doing, and are they interested?
A little bit. The older one, my oldest son is 9. So he does ask what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and famously once said to me, "Why are you always talking about women's football?" So I explained that it's my job to talk about women's football. And the younger one really doesn't understand what I do at all. He's only just 5. So for him, working from home is just a massive inconvenience, and he gets very upset when I start talking to people on the laptop because he knows I'm in a meeting and I can't attend to his every need. So yeah, less support from the 5-year-old, I'd say.
Well, it is a great inconvenience to our children that we are working
Exactly.
at home. Yeah, I agree with that. Less readily available snacks as well when we're working.
Yeah.
And TV channel changing. That's really interesting that your oldest son asked why you're talking about women's football, and you know, I've had similar conversations with my daughters, and they've had similar sort of comments in the playground about, my eldest is 8, you know, girls don't play football and all that sort of thing. It's still very much around for the younger generation, which is all the more reason why the work that you're doing is so important.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you, I mean, you know, do you get much feedback from families or visitors at the museum and about the significance and importance of the women's exhibits?
Yeah, I think we do. I think it's something we need to do more of. So we need to talk to the public more about what they want to see and what they get from seeing women's football at the museum. But for me, it's really, really obvious. Whenever we do any event or exhibition around women's football, it's really the young girls who seem to respond to it in the most positive manner. Just for them to be able to see role models really, and people who look like them doing what they want to do, I think is just hugely positive, and you can't really underestimate the impact that it has. So a lot of families and people who are into women's football already, they come because they're into the women's game now, and even though they're interested in football, they don't always know the history of the women's game. So they come along because they're interested in what's happening now in women and girls football, and what they actually go away with is a better understanding that they aren't it's not a new thing that they're doing. It's something that's got a very long history and a long tradition, and it's just that narrative hasn't been told before. And I think it helps them continue and fight some of that discrimination when they know, actually, I'm not the first person that's done this. Lots of women and girls before me have had to have this fight, and I can be part of moving that forwards. So I'd like to think that's what they get from the National Football Museum.
That is such a powerful thing, though, isn't it? To have it in their armoury. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. To be able to come back with, actually, no, this is how the history of the women's game has developed, and this is why it's where it is now, and why potentially it isn't as big as the men's game because of the history and the discrimination that's happened.
That is amazing. Well done for that. Because also there continue to be many adults, including sports journalist adults, who don't know the history of the women's game, who don't know how long ago it started, and we will talk about that later with the exhibits, but yeah, that's a really important point, that addressing that visibility. Before we get into your exhibits and this particular project you're working on, let's talk a bit about your career.
Okay.
I don't think you can be a woman in football without being asked if you actually like football, so I'm going to start that way. I suppose that question is
I have answered this a lot because I've been at the Football Museum for quite a long time, and I'm not really, or I didn't start off as a football fan. So my family weren't particular football fans. Football wasn't part of my life growing up. So I do believe that most people who consider themselves a fan have that childhood of fandom. And I don't have that, so I don't pretend to have it really. But what I have grown up with, and over recent years, is an appreciation of the material culture of football and the things that are associated with football that people get so obsessed with. And that's the reason I've really become a football fan. It's because I really like the idea of unpicking why football is so important in English society. It's the sort of obsession and sort of the lunacy of the fandom that really fascinates me. And I really love that side of the game and the way it's just integrated in everything about English society. And my background is in history, and I was always particularly interested in sort of the everyday working class culture parts of history, and it's really that's steered me towards football, and eventually steered me towards women's history as well, and women's football, I think. So I don't have a team, I don't follow a particular team, but I absolutely love what football means to people. And there's absolutely no reason why football can't be considered culture and history in the same way as any subject that's put in a museum or an art gallery. It's very accessible, and it deserves to be up there with the rest of the museums, in my opinion.
And you do go to football matches, don't you? Occasionally.
I do. Yeah, I do go to football matches. So I've started to watch more women's football over the past couple of years, really, just because it's become part of what I do all the time. And I have friends who are football fans, and it just seemed natural for me to start to attend, to take my kids. And I've always liked the idea of my kids seeing different types of football, and not just thinking that there's one type of football. So my son wanted to go and see Manchester United play, but I just thought, why does that have to be Old Trafford? So I've tried to take them to different types of football matches. So it's really been they have been my drive to sort of, to actually go and see football. Yeah.
That's great. I love that. Yeah, I love that you're doing that as a role model. And what is it like as a curator, knowing this long history and the way that women have been prevented from playing, and then seeing the WSL as it is now? Do you sort of make that connection when you're watching it?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I went to see the Manchester derby in September last year, so City and United at the Etihad, and to see the number of people that were there, and to get the tram, and to see, it felt like a huge football match that the whole city were excited about. And I was in the museum prior to the match as well, and we get a lot of visitors to the museum that have come into the city for football, and you had that sense that people had come to Manchester to see this football match. And for me, that felt like the first time that had happened, really, whilst I was at work, to feel that for a women's football match. I haven't been lucky enough to go to Women's World Cup, so for me, it was sort of that really big game. So yeah, exactly. When I saw that game and had that build up to it, I really thought, yeah, I could understand it was a momentous occasion because of the history.
That's so cool. And in your household, you were into gymnastics, weren't you? And your parents weren't into football. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, my parents weren't into sport, to be honest. I don't know. I don't really know where I got my sportiness from, but I was always a very sporty girl, I suppose, and really got into gymnastics when I was young, all the way up to my teenage years. And I can't help thinking that if football had been an option, I might have done it. It really just wasn't an option in the 1980s at school. Girls did not play football. I didn't know a single girl that played football, but girls did do gymnastics and they did do dance. So that's what I did, and I did absolutely love it. But now I play with my kids, and it's so much fun. I can't believe how much fun it is. It's fun in a way that other sports aren't. It's just, there's a freedom to it, I think, that you don't get from even gymnastics, which is quite controlled, or running, which is the other sport that I do. Yeah, football's just really good fun. I'm terrible at it, but I'm playing with a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, so it doesn't matter at all, I don't think. But I can't help thinking if I'd had the opportunity, I might have played more when I was younger.
I love that, because I play with my just turned 4-year-old and 8-year-old, and it makes me feel like I'm a little bit good at it. But at my 8-year-old school, a few years ago, they didn't have girls football, they just had boys football, which really annoyed me. So we managed to set up a girls football club, and she started playing, and she's now a lot better than I am in a very short space.
Right. Yeah, my kids are rubbish as well, which is great, because like you say, it does make me, but they just have loads of fun with it. I'm not bothered at all. They're not particularly good. It's just a ridiculous amount of fun.
So you've gone on to be a curator, but how did that happen? How does anybody become a curator? Because it seems like one of those jobs, it must be so hard to get. It's such a precious role.
It is sort of a dream job, I suppose. And when I was a kid, the other thing that I was really interested in was museums. So I have very clear memories of going to my local museum as a kid, and also on holiday, we went to museums a lot. And I always saw it as this unattainable dream job, I suppose, that no normal person got. So after doing a history degree, I didn't really know what to do with it, which I think is common with somebody with a history degree. I didn't want to be a teacher. I didn't particularly want to go down the academic route. And I just remember looking at things inside cases in museums and just thinking, why is that there? And who's decided to put that there? And just wanting to do that, really. So after getting a clerical job actually at the Football Museum years and years and years ago, I did my master's degree, which is sort of a prerequisite for a curatorial job, is to have that master's qualification, which I don't necessarily agree with, because I do think it means that it's quite unattainable for some people to become a curator. And being a curator is so different now to what it was maybe even 10 years ago. I think the way that curators are selected and trained could probably do with changing slightly.
What do you mean by that? I'm sort of interpreting it as in the media, it's very hard. It tends to be people who are quite privileged who get opportunities. Is it a similar kind of thing?
Yeah, it's quite traditionally, I'd argue that the museum sector is sort of geared towards people who are privileged enough to be able to get a university degree and then have the support to do a master's degree. Often you have to work for free as a volunteer or at very low pay as an entry-level curator before you're anywhere near able to support yourself in the role. And it just means that lots of people just can't do it. It's impossible. There are not that many curatorial jobs either. So I just think there's other ways which we have to make the sector more accessible, really, before museums will really change and really reflect society as it is. And that goes for things like women's history as well in museums.
Absolutely. And how did you end up in this role? You weren't a football fan. Did you see it advertised and think?
I did a clerical role at NFM for a few years, and then I actually worked for Liverpool Archives documenting Everton Football Club's collection. So that's really when I would say that job was the one that taught me how to look after a museum collection, and also gave me a real sort of appreciation of the, like I said before, the material culture of football. So the photographs, the programmes, the shirts, the kit. I absolutely loved Goodison Park. There was just something about it that I loved where it was. I loved the community you got around Goodison Park as well. So I did that for 3 years, and then I saw that the museum, National Football Museum, had moved from Preston to Manchester, and just thought that was just an amazing opportunity to take a museum about football to Manchester and to that building as well, which for people who don't know Manchester, it's an iconic building right in the city centre. It was just an amazing opportunity. So they needed help to physically move their objects from Preston to Manchester, and I'd done something similar with the Everton collection. So it just seemed like a perfect match, really, and it's just gone from there. So as I've worked at the Football Museum, I've just continued to be obsessed with the objects, with the collection itself, and just gained more and more knowledge about particularly the women's side of the game, and that's how it's progressed, really.
And did you, when you were at Everton, was it all men's archives?
Yeah. I don't think there was a single object that related to the women's team or any women's football in the Liverpool area at all. It was all Everton men's team. Yeah.
And I suppose no one ever just questioned that, even though Everton women's team have an illustrious history.
Yeah, nobody questioned that at all. The collection had come from a private collection. That's something that you find in football as well, is that a lot of the culture of football lies with private collectors, and their interest is usually in the men's game. And that sort of, it is those men that collect that material that then reflects what gets saved by football teams and by museums, and what becomes the history of the game is what they collect. So if they don't collect women's material, that history is lost. It falls through the gaps, really, because it doesn't fit into other areas of history where museums or archives might collect it. So yeah, it was really obvious to me that what people collected became the history of football, and it was very one-sided.
So the last time I went to the National Football Museum, which was at Manchester, and it is a beautiful building. And I think somebody else has put in the comments as well that the last time they went, there wasn't much women's football in there.
Yeah.
And there's now this real commitment to make a change. Can you tell us why is that, and what is the commitment?
It's quite a recent change. So when we opened in 2012 in the Urbis building, our women's football collection was very, very small. So the curators at the time really did their best to integrate what they had through the gallery, but often they were sort of forcing the themes of the men's game onto the women's collection, or vice versa. So you had these overall themes that really suited the history of the narrative of the men's game, but not necessarily the women's, and the women's game was sort of forced into them a little bit. And partly, again, they just didn't have the material to display. So that it really does come back to what you've got in your collection. And then, like Alex said in the introduction, in 2018, we got a huge collection from a private collector, a man in America who was obsessed with women's football, had played football himself, coached women's soccer in the US, and then had just gone on a private mission to collect the history of the game. And we were really lucky to purchase that collection with the help of a Heritage Lottery Fund grant. And without that collection, I don't think this whole project would have been kick-started, really. I managed to convince people it'd be a good idea to keep those skills within the team and let me manage that project. I was really keen to get a specialism within the collection by that point as well. And that really started it all off, because I'd already worked there. I continued to work there once the project had ended, and it meant that I could keep all those skills within the team, keep the knowledge within the team, and really advocate for keeping this going after the project ended, because a lot of diversity projects end once the funding ended. But in this case it didn't, which I think was a combination of me not pushing it, continue to push it, but also the senior management at the team at the museum had really recognised that this was very important. We don't want to stop doing this now. And it was a combination of the project and the senior management coming together and making this really bold statement, which, if I'm honest, surprised me as the curator that we were going to take it this far. But once it had been made, I thought it was absolutely fantastic, and it's a really brave and bold statement.
It certainly is, and it's so exciting that that it's been kick-started by this absolutely brilliant collection. I remember when we spoke on the phone a couple of years ago, you were sorting through, you were still in the process of cataloguing. I think you said it was 5,000 items, was it?
It's about that. It's about 6,000 items, so it's a lot more than we'd originally anticipated. And by cataloguing it and spending almost 2 years just looking at it, it meant that I could see where the gaps were. So after it finished, I could see, right, well, we're not telling this story, we're not telling that story, this area is underrepresented. And it meant that I could go out and really target the areas of the collection that I thought the stories we needed to tell. And that meant that I could make lots of contacts with the women's football community and say, look, your history or your stories aren't represented here, and we would like them to be. And that meant that we could really start to tell some of those hidden stories, and we can in the future tell those stories because we have a collection that represents them now.
That's so interesting. And what were the gaps?
So in particular, because Chris Unger, the man who originally collected the material, was American, it was a very international collection, which I don't think we appreciated at the time, which is fantastic, but meant there was not a lot of English domestic women's football in there. And the period between about 1960 to 1990, where you get the Women's Football Association in control of football in this country, that wasn't particularly well represented. There was a couple of objects there. So we started to make links with the women that played in that period and the women that worked for the WFA as well. And I mean, there's still huge gaps. We're nowhere near finished. So it's almost like the WSL hasn't happened in terms of our collection. So I'm very much trying to collect from women that play now. And I find that a lot of the women that I contact, they always respond by, or very often respond by, why do you want this material? They don't appreciate the importance of what they've got, often in their basements or their spare rooms. So I have to explain to them, whatever generation they're from, no, this is the history of the women's game. You've got it in your drawer, essentially. So we need to make that public. So please, could you lend it or donate it to the National Football Museum?
And how unusual is it for a curator at a national museum to be undertaking that kind of role, where you're speaking to people and trying to convince them to share things in their attic?
I think contemporary collecting is a big part of what curators do now. So it's being a curator is much more of a two-way dialogue, really, between the curator and the community that they serve, to make sure that they're representing that story. So that isn't that unusual, I don't think. A lot of curators are doing that. I don't know many curators that focus almost exclusively on women's history. So to have a role at the National Football Museum that does that, I think is really progressive. And again, that came out of that project. That role didn't exist before. And now we've made that bold statement. It needs somebody whose focus is almost exclusively women's football.
Okay, so summer of 2021, there's going to be an amazing collection launch, an amazing exhibition launch. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so we've been working towards this for a little while, with 2021 being the centenary of the FA ban. on women's football in 1921, we wanted to really make that a big year at the museum. So we have a temporary exhibition area which changes relatively frequently. So about once every 6 to 9 months, we have a new exhibition in that space. And that in summer 2021 will be dedicated to women's football. I'm very keen that that will be broader and it will be about women in football. I'd really like to tell the stories of women that have been working in football outside of playing for generations as well. So I'm trying very hard to steer it in that direction. And because we're still at the planning stage with that, we are really trying to decide what the themes are going to be. What are we going to look at? Which stories are we going to tell? So what I'm doing now is trying to build links with the women's football community and women in football to say, well, what are those stories? What would people like to see? So we haven't really defined exactly what's going to go on display in that exhibition. It's still an evolving process, and we'll be doing lots of public consultation, hopefully, to find out, you know, what we should be displaying in that exhibition. It was going to have a link to the Euros as well, but because they've been postponed, I know that's going to have to change slightly because Manchester was due to be a host city in 2021, and it would have been a huge celebration of women's football. So that is disappointing, but I'm trying to make it into a positive and think we can do 2021 and then we can do 2022, and then it will be a process of different interpretations of women's football rather than just doing a one-off exhibition.
Love the positive spin on it.
Yeah.
Before we get all too down about having to wait an extra year to watch the Euros, boo, let's look at some of these brilliant items that you're going to share with us.
Okay.
Cassie, if you can pop the first one up on the screen, that would be great. Oh, I'm so excited about this bit. Right. Tell us about this image.
So I chose this object because it's the oldest one that we have in the collection, that represents women kicking a ball about. So this is from 1869. It's from a magazine called Harper's Bazaar, which was sort of a fashionable magazine at the time. And I love it, one, because it's the oldest thing that we have. I mean, the original print was actually in black and white, and it was alongside some other images of women taking part in sport. So there were women swimming, rowing, and doing something else. I can't remember what it is now. So there's 4 images. And I just think it's really interesting that at the time, it was a really fashionable magazine that they chose women playing football to be on display in that. It was obviously interesting and popular enough for them to think this is something we need to put in this magazine. So it really just challenges the perception that women's football is new. Women have probably been kicking the ball about in as long as men have. It's not a new phenomenon at all.
That is absolutely extraordinary. That really is, because we always talk about, you know, the anniversary of the founding of the men's FA, and here are women playing football right around that exact time.
Yeah. I mean, it's unimaginable that they weren't, to be honest. I mean, why wouldn't have they been kicking a ball about? It's nonsense, really.
That's so great, and I love their fancy finery as well.
Yeah, it's not particularly practical to be playing football in. But another theme that comes up time and time again in women's football is what women wear when they play and how they present themselves when they play football. All of the challenges that women have now in football, they've had them since 1869. It's not changed that much.
And it's really it's a pretty cool picture. Right in the background, you can get a hint of what the other women are doing too. There's a woman climbing a pole. There's another one.
Yeah, it's like gymnastics going on or something, I think. Yeah. So I suppose it's that era where, you know, muscular Christianity, I suppose, and that, you know, as a sport as a positive thing for people, a moral thing to be doing. And I think it's slightly later when you get the really negative views of women's football in the 1920s. At this point, it was interesting and intriguing and not too much of a threat to be too negative about, I think.
Right. Okay. So we're still in the novelty period here.
A novelty period here, I think. Yeah.
Let's move to the next object, and you can tell us how the sort of rampant misogyny started creeping in.
So this is one of my favourite things in the museum, just partly because of how rare it is and the story that it tells. So it is a medal awarded to a woman called Lillian Bridget, who played for Stoke Ladies. It was awarded in 1922, and it was for winning the English Ladies Football Association Cup, which ran for just one season, 1 year. And the ELFA was really set up in direct response to the FA ban in 1921. So clubs came together and they wanted to prove that women's football could be organised, and that it could be done in the same way that the men's leagues were done. and that the money that they were making largely for charity could be used in an appropriate way. So one of the things that was levelled against women's football at the time was that the money that was being raised for charity was disappearing or not being used correctly. So they really wanted to challenge all these negative views and set up the ELFA. I think the first meeting, there was about 30 women's teams took part in the first meeting, or representatives from the team. They had a meeting later on that there was 50 or so teams. So there was quite a large number of teams that were interested in becoming part of this setup. And not that much is known about the ELFA, but it didn't last. So without a real league structure or any of the sort of the things that you have in place to support men's football, it just sort of drifted away. And the Ditka ladies, which were the really big team at the time, didn't for some reason take part in this, which may have had an impact on it as well. But the fact that this sort of competitive cup competition was going on in 1921, 1922, I think is really fascinating. And obviously when people think about the Women's FA Cup, they don't think about this.
I mean, that medal is absolutely...
Yeah, it's gorgeous. Yeah, it's really, really nice.
And just so incredible that this competition was taking place after the ban.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of football did continue after the ban. Women didn't stop playing football. It just made it a lot harder.
Brilliant. And what else have we got? What's next?
Oh, so that is the reverse of the medal. And then the next one is again another one of my favourites. It's a shirt worn by a team called Manchester Corinthians ladies football team. They were a Manchester-based team. They were set up in 1949, and they were trailblazers, pioneers. They travelled the world in the 50s, often again raising money for charity, doing things that women of that period just couldn't conceive of. So they went to Holland, Portugal, South America, just playing football. At one point they had Bert Trautmann, the famous City player, go over to Germany with them as a translator while they took part in a competition. And some of the things that they were doing in that period was absolutely fascinating, and they've just been forgotten about until very recently. And the National Football Museum and other academics who look at women's football are really keen to make sure that their story is told, because nobody knows about them really outside of their very small women's football history network, and we really want to make that story more accessible.
Every time I look at that era of women's football, there are often really high-profile male champions of the women's game who are involved. Yeah. Bert Trautmann, as you've mentioned, and I think there were some '66 World Cup winners that were also involved in promoting the game. That gives such a different perspective on how women's football was received at the time. Can you sort of explain how that makes sense?
I think it's always been the case that there's always been men interested in football or who are in football that don't see the problem with women playing football at all. For them, it's just women playing football, and why can they not play it to the same standard and get the same support as the men who play football as well. I think it's a misogyny in the more general male population that dictates why women's football hasn't developed or is developed in a different way than the men's game. It certainly isn't necessarily the men who play football themselves or are interested in the game themselves. For them, they just want as many people as possible to play the game at a high standard. And around this period, you do get quite a lot of men who start to get interested in the commercial potential of women's football as well, and they can see slightly later than this that there's a market there, that there's something there that can grow and can be driven. But yeah, for many reasons, it doesn't quite at this stage.
Yeah, and that's brilliant that people sensed a commercial opportunity back then in the 60s, yeah. And then here we are, half a century later, we're still talking about whether there is a commercial opportunity.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just love that Bert Trautmann was just their translator. We're so used
to yeah,
sort of lowly roles.
Hugely successful footballer, yeah, and just being the translator.
Yeah, brilliant. What's next? Wow.
This is one of a series of photographs that we have in the collection, thanks to the Chris Unger collection, of the 1971 unofficial World Cup in Mexico, Women's World Cup in Mexico. And the reason that I chose this one in particular is just because you can see the size of the crowd. So this was an example of people realising that there was a desire for and commercial potential in women's football. So a group of businessmen really got this off the ground, first in Italy in 1970 and then later in Mexico in 1971. And although there wasn't an official England team at this point, the WFA was still trying to make decisions about how they could select an official England team. An unofficial team was pulled together and sent to Mexico, and we have been in touch with quite a few of the women that played in that team, and they've been absolutely fantastic in donating objects from their own personal collections. So we have a medal that was awarded to one of the players, Leah Caleb, on display in the museum. We have a bag that all the teams were given as well, donated by another player. And I just love this image because it shows that if you ask what women's football looked like in the 70s, to most people, they wouldn't expect it to look like that. And I've never showed it to anybody, any of these images, and they haven't been surprised by it because of the size of the event and the crowd.
Because a lot of people don't know, but the 1971 World Cup unofficially has the biggest ever crowd for a women's sport event. Is that right?
The final, I don't know the exact figure. I'm not sure if it was overtaken by the 99 final. I'd have to check. But yeah, it was in the Aztec Stadium, so the same place as the men's tournament in 70. So that was they hadn't really made that. It was the 1970 Men's World Cup, 1971 Women's World Cup. They were sort of billed, not as equals, but very much at a similar level.
That's extraordinary. I love that crowd. And do we know who these players are? And
no, I don't know much about the players at all. A lot of them are, they have notes on the back, they're press photography, it's not in English. And so it can be quite difficult really to find out exactly who's playing and what's going on. On the back of this it says it's Mexico, England. That's all I know.
Great, love that.
But I'm not even sure if that's definite. It's just what's been written on the back at the time.
Brilliant. And do we know whether these photos would have been published back in England at the time?
I don't know if this particular one was. There was some press coverage. Sorry, somebody's knocking on my door. There was some press coverage at the time, but there was a lot in Mexico itself that was overall pretty positive about the tournament. But if you speak to the women that played when they came back, they were sort of, or they feel like they were sort of forgotten about. So they had this amazing time at the tournament where they were very well supported. They got a lot of support from the Mexican population. They absolutely loved the England team. But when they came back, they were sort of just forgotten about, and it all sort of just disappeared. And it's part of their own personal history that they've just recently been reliving through some of the work that NFM and other academics have been doing as well.
Brilliant. Do you need to get the door?
No, it's fine. Yeah, I think it's just postman always knocks at the moment and then leaves stuff on the step.
Right, what's next? What else have you got to show us? Oh, wow.
This object, again, didn't come from the Chris Unger collection. This came from me really making links with the women's football community as part of that project. So I think by chance I met Liz Deegan at an event. So she played for around 12 years for the England national team. And she said, oh yeah, I've got absolutely loads of stuff in my house if you want to come and have a look at it. So myself and my colleague at the time just went round to hers, and she had this absolutely enormous collection of just amazing material. And this is one of my particular favourite objects from her collection. It was the cap that she was given. So every woman that played for England was given a cap for their first appearance. And because the FA at the time didn't award caps to women players, they had their own caps. They made their own. So a woman called Flo Bilton handmade the England caps, and then they were presented to the women at the time. So it's that sort of DIY aspect to it that I absolutely adore, and the idea of a collective of women coming together to produce something like this and making sure that these women were acknowledged in some way. And just the fact that Liz has put on there some of the badges of the places she's travelled playing football and the teams that she's played against. So it's that combination of real personal history and the wider history of the women's football within this one item that I love so much.
It's such an extraordinary object, and
it really is, yeah.
There's so much of women's history is bound up in sort of craft and
exactly. Yeah.
What I have to ask you, why is there a gnome at the back? Do you know? Is it a gnome?
Liz told me and I can't remember why. I'll have to ask her again why there's a gnome at the back. I don't know. But it's on display like that in the museum. We haven't touched it at all. We haven't taken anything off it. But it's one of those objects that we've recently put on display.
That's absolutely brilliant. And the woman who made it, she wasn't a footballer herself. What was her connection?
I think she did play actually, Flo Milton a little bit, but she was, by the time she was making these caps, she was a supporter and administrator at the Women's Football Association, but I don't think she was playing at that point.
Right.
But yeah, she was a real supporter of the women's game, and it's nice to have her work recognised, I suppose.
Brilliant. Love that so much. Right, what's next? This is such a treat. Thank you.
This object is one of my favourites. We've got quite a few from the '99 World Cup. Again, partly because Chris Unger went to all of the World Cups, so he obsessively collects all the material from the really early Women's World Cup finals. And being American, obviously, I had quite good access to all of the ephemera that was produced for the '99 World Cup. So obviously, the US team won it in front of a huge crowd. They became household names. There was huge support for them as well, and just the fact that it's a women's team appearing on the front of a really big magazine, I think is fascinating. But for me, this just represents the wider tournament. So they were really ambitious, the Americans, in '99, and really made it a huge tournament, huge venues. They put lots of effort into marketing it, and it worked. It really did get a lot of support, and they produced so much sort of tat that you could purchase around the '99 World Cup. So our collection is full of key rings and blow up balls and t-shirts, and there's a drum, and there's Barbie dolls that look like Mia Hamm, there's posters, there is just so much. There's cereal packets with Michelle Akers on the front, and there's just so much stuff that was produced in '99 for the women's game.
That's brilliant. I love that. I really want to see the cereal packet now.
Yeah, I think you can see that online on our online collection. I'll have to check, but yeah, it's quite cool.
And it's interesting, this image that they've chosen for the front, because I think for most of us, when we think of that '99 Cup final, we think of Brandy Chastain with her shirt. Yeah. I think she is behind. She's the one being embraced, but we're not. It's
not that image. Yeah, exactly.
Why was there? Was imagery different around that time? And the Brandy Chastain celebration is what we now remember, but wasn't. Is there an explanation for that?
There's a really nice couple of objects that I like to look at together, and one of them is the programme from the '99 World Cup, which has a really athletic player on the front. And then if you go back to look at some of the early ones, even in Mexico was a fantastic event, but their mascot was a very feminized little girl, essentially. Didn't look anything like a football player. By '99, you start to get images of athletic women playing football as part of the branding of women's football. And there's also a really great magazine with Mia Hamm's face on it. So it's just her face, but it's a really strong image about how she's a role model and an athlete. So yeah, I think you do get a change then in how women are portrayed as athletes when they're footballers at this point. But like you say, everybody remembers that image. I think because it's perpetuated, so every time somebody talks about '99, they stick that image against it, so you almost have to fight back and put all the other ones there instead.
Brilliant. What's next?
This is an obvious one just because of the player. So it's Marta's shirt from the 2003 World Cup. So I just feel you can't really have a list of objects that talk about women's football without having one that references Marta. She's been such a fantastic role model and player throughout her career, and I use this shirt as well as an example of how what we do in NFM is sort of challenging the narrative of football, because we made the decision to display this next to Maradona's shirt in the display case that looks at the World Cup from 1970 onwards. So previously we had Maradona's shirt on display, and that was sort of our iconic shirt. But the story now is that this is a male player and a female player that have had a huge influence on their national team and part of their success story for their national team, and they're side by side. So I like to use that shirt as an example of how we're changing some of our display cases so they have this 50-50 representation and the story isn't male football with a little bit of women's football stuck at the side. It's interpreting football for both genders in the same way.
That's so good. And it's so interesting that you've got the 2003 World Cup shirt, because I think for many of us, Marta really burst onto the scene the next World Cup, 2007, and she scored that amazing goal against the US in the semi-final. I mean, she's played in 4 World Cups now, but so to have the 2003 one, why was that? Why did you choose?
Well, this again, like a lot of the things that came from Chris Unger's collection, there's very little explanation as to how he got them and why he chose to collect certain objects. So we just have to assume for some reason that he either managed to get it through personal contacts or he purchased it online, because at this point when he was collecting women's football material, the market would have been very, very small for it. And you can see where a lot of the shirts in his collection, there are personal notes written to him from the players saying, thank you, Chris, this is from whatever American player. So I think it's just a case of what he could get his hands on. So, and then it's ended up in our collection.
Brilliant. Oh, that's amazing. Right, what's next?
I
love that shirt.
Yeah, I know, it is just a fantastic shirt. I wanted to show really that we are collecting now, so we're collecting the contemporary women's games. So obviously we're very interested in the history of the game, but I think as important is that of all of the museums, the Football Museum needs to be a contemporary place. It needs to show football as it is now, and obviously having the Nike designed bespoke shirts for the 2019 Women's World Cup was a defining moment. It's the first time that it happened, and this for me is the best example of those shirts as well. So I thought it was really important that we collected it. And we've recently had an exhibition called Strip, which looks at the development of football shirts, the design and technology of football shirts. And we couldn't do an exhibition about that without having at least one of those series of football kits in it. So we decided to purchase this one, and it's currently on display in that exhibition.
It's fantastic, such an iconic shirt. We've got one more object to look at.
Okay. This was the last thing that I collected before the museum had to shut because of the lockdown. So we collected these on International Women's Day this year. And we collected a few objects, but these are Gemma Bonner's football boots that she wore at the Manchester Derby, the first WSL Manchester Derby in September 2019. So to mark the occasion, and because they were playing at the Etihad Stadium, they had an artist draw a bee design, the Manchester worker bee design, on all of the players' boots, on most of the players' boots. So the Manchester United players had little red bees and the City players had the blue ones. And Gemma has lent these boots to the National Football Museum for display. She said they were really important to her just because she wore them at that match for the first time, but she said she's worn them quite a few times since, but she doesn't want to wear them anymore in case she ruins them, basically. So she's given them to us in the original box. And they're so important really because of the attendance that day. Was a WSL record. It was about 31,000. So I think it was a really important moment for women's football in Manchester as well. And obviously we're in Manchester, so it was just a perfect fit.
Yeah, and I think boots in particular have such a significance for women's football. I know I've written before about women not having women specific boots, or struggling to get boot sponsors, or struggling to get boots at all, and certainly not having the sort of really stylish boots that are personalised in the way that you see a lot of really flashy men's players have.
Yeah, these are great, and you could tell she really loved these boots when she handed them over. She really likes them.
It was wonderful looking through those. There's a slogan on the inside of the France shirt that says "Our differences unite us," and that speaks so much to many of the sort of cultural struggles that the France national team has gone through and continue to go through, because they still have a hijab ban in French football. There is a conversation to be had around the kind of invisibility, particularly of ethnic minorities from women's history, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about why they are so invisible and what are the barriers to unearthing a more diverse history of the women's game.
I think it goes back to the fact that women's history generally is quite invisible. So as I said before, it's a lot of what we see as public history is what people have collected, what archives and museums have deemed important enough to collect in the past, or what people have said, to archives and museums, please collect this material. So that's what makes tracking women's history sometimes quite difficult, particularly working class women's history, because they don't have the physical material that gets deposited in these places. And that's amplified, I think, for that particular community. So because these things aren't saved and aren't deposited in places, it's really difficult to find evidence of their contribution to football. It's obviously there, but without the evidence, it's very difficult for a museum to say this happened or that happened, or this is the first person to do that, or this is the first person to achieve this. Particularly in the further back you go, so in the late 19th century or early 20th century, there won't be records of all the individual women that played football. They just don't exist. So it makes finding that history really, really hard. And that has just continued, really, that those objects from those people's history don't get put in a museum, or they don't get put in an archive. So curators have to go out there and find them. And that isn't always easy to do, because you have to build links with that community. And often you'll find that curators aren't from that background themselves. So the AME representation amongst curatorial staff is very low. It's low at NFM, it's low amongst all museums, really. So it makes doing that even harder. And I think for me, the way that NFM has really positively discriminated towards women's football and said, right, no, it's going to be 50%, we're going to have somebody who just looks at this. We need to do that for BAME representation across football, not just women's football, but definitely in women's football too. And we need to start to really proactively collect that material, and not just sit back and say, somebody will give us that material one day. They won't. We have to go out and we have to find it. And it is a big challenge. It really is.
Mm-hmm. It's good to know that it's being thought about, though.
It's been thought about across the sector, really. It's just a very, very slow progress, I would say. It needs a big, bold movement. And part of my argument before about always having to have a master's degree before you can start working in a museum, it just rules out a lot of people from those backgrounds. And I don't think it's a prerequisite to being able to interpret a museum object. What you need to do that is experience of that history, and be able to understand it. So for me, you need to be from that background to really tell those stories.
There's so many things we can talk about. I'm noticing that we haven't got that much time. One really important thing I think we have to say for everybody on here: if you know about an object, if you want to contribute to the exhibition, how do you go about doing that, and how can we spread the word as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important, because I am only obviously one person trying to work on this exhibition, and I can't meet any of the targets. I can't meet the 50% target without active engagement from the women's football community. So it's just a shout out for people to get in touch with me, or anybody really at the National Football Museum, but ideally come to me and talk to me about what you've got, what your stories are. It will be a very a process where we'd like to co-create this exhibition, so it won't be me just deciding what goes on display and what the stories are. I'd very much like to make it a two-way process. So if people are interested, I don't know if there's some way to share my email or contact details after this. We will be doing a series of public consultation in advance of the exhibition, which was meant to be at the museum, but it might be online because of the current situation. So I can certainly share those details when we have them as well. But please just engage with us, because the history of the women's game is with women in football members, really.
Mm. And we will just spend 5 minutes doing questions as well. But before we do that, I just want to ask another question, which is if people are at home, or there are people who have missed this chat and others want to share it, how can we look at the exhibits in the National Football Museum during lockdown at the moment?
We have a website which has some of our objects on there. We have an area called Collections Online, which has a small amount of women's material on there. We have a new exhibition called Strip, which is now online as well. So if you look for National Football Museum Strip, and you'll notice there's quite a lot of women's material on that website now. So looking at the design and technology of women's football kits and their history. And we have a YouTube channel. We're quite active on Twitter. So usually a lot of our community activities and learning activities will be available on those platforms. So if you follow us on Twitter, you'll see everything that we do online usually.
Brilliant. I'm seeing lots of lovely comments here, people really enjoying the conversation, enjoying you talking through the objects. I can't find the list of questions though. Cassie, can you help us? Is there a list that I should be looking at for questions?
Sorry, I'm going to unmute myself, Anna, so you can hear me. Do you want me to read them out? Would that be easy?
Oh, yes, please. That would be great, just because I can't see them on screen.
Bear with me. So, okay, first one from Katia. In an era of digital transformation, are there any plans to create a digital archive for the NFM? It would be a great way to share the history of the women's game to the world.
Shall I answer? Yes, we are hoping to do a lot more digital content. Partly it's the lockdown has forced us to focus on what we're doing online a lot more than we were previously. So you would very much get distracted by what was going on in the gallery. But we have tried to raise some money to try and increase our online content. And a big part of that is trying to spend the money and the time to digitise what we have. So it's quite hard to digitise museum objects and to make them look nice online. And it's a big challenge for all museums, but it's something that we'll definitely do more of, especially given the current situation.
Sorry to butt in as well because I can't see the questions, but I'm just having a quick look through the comments, and people joined from all over the world, from Singapore, really Dubai, America, Northern Ireland, Italy. Just amazing. Thank you so much for tuning in. Cassie, are there any other questions that we can put to Belinda?
Yes, sorry, bear with me 2 seconds. Sorry about this slight technical hitch, everybody. What kind of items get collected? That's a question from Zara, and I think this was more at the start of the session. But okay, what kind of things do you look out for, Belinda?
I look out for a variety of things. So the story behind it. So an object has got a good personal, an interesting personal story. That's something that we like to collect. Things from defining moments as well, that tell a wider story. Something we like to collect. I'm really interested in photography. I find that female photographers will capture football in a slightly different way than male photographers do. So those sort of objects, and even the sort of stuff that people think isn't interesting, so tickets, programs, all that sort of stuff is stuff that we would consider collecting at the National Football Museum. We have a pretty broad collecting policy. We do focus mainly on the English game, although our women's collection is quite international. Generally, we look at the women's game in England, or England women's football internationally, so World Cups and that sort of thing as well, or UEFA finals. Yeah.
That's cool. I've seen a question pop up. It's from Zara, and she says, would you collect female fan stories?
Yes, we would. So as I said before, although the focus quite often is on women who play football, that is not exclusively what we're trying to do with this 50% pledge. So it's about women's involvement in football as fans, as players, as women who work in football, as referees, as photographers, as artists. Whatever their involvement is in football, then it's a valid story for us to tell. So yes, definitely.
That's amazing. If there's any sort of call out that you can do on social media, please let Women in Football know, let me know. We can try and amplify it, because I think that's such a brilliant...
Going towards the 2021 exhibition, we will definitely be doing that. Yeah, we'll definitely put something out.
Great. We've got just a minute left.
Okay.
So I think, are there any sort of final words that we can leave people with, either about being a curator or about the way the exhibition is developing and what you hope it will achieve?
Well, I think one of the questions that Cassie suggested was about how what we do going forwards after lockdown, and I'm trying to stay positive about it, despite the fact that it looks like women's football might be negatively impacted by some of the financial pressures. And I just really hope that people, or any organisations that sort of dipped its toe in equality, doesn't pull back from that now and think, right, well, that we can't do that anymore because money is tight, so we're just going to move back away from the equality agenda. And if anything, I hope they really see that growth going forwards is based on them carrying on with that agenda and not retracting and retreating away from it. So I really hope that, I think NFM will do that. It's brave enough to say this is a long-term commitment, it's not going to change, and we're going to continue to do this. It's a really important part of what we do, and I hope that other places involved in women's football do the same, I suppose.
That is so good to hear, because we're reading daily how women's rights are being stripped back at the moment.
Exactly. Yeah.
In football, so thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Belinda.
Thank you very much.
Fascinating chat. Love that. It was just like going to a museum for an hour this afternoon. So thank you.
I mean, if people are in Manchester in the future, please do come. It's not just stuff inside display cases. We do events, we do activities. It's a very interactive space. So yeah, we'd love to see more people, particularly women's football fans, in the museum. We really need to develop that audience.
Brilliant. Thank you, Belinda. I'm going to hand back to Alex.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I think, Anna, you took the words out of my mouth. It was amazing seeing how people were online from all over the world this afternoon. I'm going to give Michelle Dorgan a shout out because she was the first one to write saying what an amazing session it was. I was asked before I was going to do this to say something like that, and that I could go off and do something if I wanted and come back at the end, but I was kind of just glued and listening, and it was really fascinating. And working at FIFA, where again I'm trying in my role to try and push women's game forward, definitely will pick up with Belinda on the work that you're doing, and particularly I think the 2021 exhibition sounds fantastic. As somebody who used to work at the FA and work with the women's team, and hear some of those stories about how, you know, where the game could be now if it wasn't for that 50-year hiatus. It's amazing to think where we could be now. But I would definitely pick up with you. I think it was fascinating. I've been asked to say, and I think Cassie's already mentioned it in the chat, that there will be some notes coming around after this for everybody who joined today. If you've got any feedback on the seminar, and particularly anything that you would like to see or hear differently, drop an email. It's info@womeninfootball.co.uk. And if you'd like to spread the word about how great these are, this was my first one, I'll definitely be back. You can retweet the Women in Football tweets as well, and make sure that other members and other people potentially join for future seminars, because I think this is fantastic. So I'll leave everybody to the rest of their day. It's getting very dark here in Zurich, so I look like a hostage in front of my white wall, but I'll let everybody get on with the rest of their day. Thanks, Anna. Thanks, Belinda. It was fantastic. Thanks, Cassie, for holding everything together and pulling the chat together and the questions at the end. And hopefully, I'll be sat in the background for a future chat in the next coming days. Have a good day, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks, Alex.